Okay, so I am speaking to Sydney. Come in, Sydney. We're going to have a wonderful three-screen conversation. This interview tonight is for me, it's tonight. For you Australians, it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon or something tomorrow. So I love that. It drives me crazy, but it's fun. I'm chatting with on my left. You both have glasses. We're going to be in trouble. But anyway, on my left, which may or may not be so when we realign this thing, is Daniel Yeadon, cellist. Nod, thank you. Henceforth, Daniel Yeadon will be called Danny. I'm Dan, he's Daniel. We've talked about this. It's okay. And the other guy is pianist Neal Perez da Costa. And we are going to be talking about a really, you know, pardon? Am I? Okay, we're going to be talking about a wonderful. It's charming, is the word. 19th century romantic, charming, and we'll talk about the execution of this CD. Two fabulous works for piano quintet, two French works by a piano quintet by Camille Saint-Saëns. We all know that person, and some of you out there may know of Louise Farrenc. Her quintet for piano and strings, number one. Both works are in A minor. I found that rather interesting. Just, we'll see about that. We'll talk about that in a bit. But that's it. It's a. Let me get the producers here. By the way, the ensemble, because this is quintet that we're going to be chatting about. We're talking about the cellist and the pianist in this particular circumstance. But Ironwood Ensemble. The quintet is known as Australia's, I hope you like that I'm quoting this, Australia's renowned, historically informed performance group. I love that choice of word. Historically informed. You can get away with murder with it, historically informed. And the CD is called Romantic Dreams, Quintets for Piano and Strings. And these, as I said earlier, French romantic works from the mid-19th century, 1840s, 30s, 40s, 50s, not much later than that, by these two amazing composers. Now, let me tell you who these guys are just a little bit, and then we'll try and get me to shut up, and we'll get on with some chat. Cellist, viola da gambist, Daniel Yeadon. In addition to Ironwood, you play. By the way, John Elliott Gardner. You have played in all kinds of ensembles: Australian Chamber Orchestra, Australian Romantic and Classical Orchestra, the English Baroque Soloists, which I remember as a kid when John Elliott Gardner was in London so much, and he really I've had a couple of encounters with him, wonderful encounters, but his interpretation of Baroque music changed my life and re-energized the whole repertoire. Anyway, you have been with good company over these many years, as I said, English Baroque soloists and others. You were a member of the really renowned Fitzwilliam String Quartet, and you completed in 2016, that's recently, your PhD, focusing on group learning experiences of students in tertiary music institutions. You can send me an essay on what that means later. You're currently lecturer in the Historic Performance Division. That's why I might get in trouble here. Lecturer in the Historical Performance Division at Sydney Conservatorium of Music at the University of Sydney. I think that's enough of you. Now, Neal Perez da Costa, harpsichord, organ, pianist. Associate Dean of Research and Professor of Historical Performance at Sydney Conservatoire. That's where you got in league and plotted your various projects, I'm sure. University of Sydney, you perform regularly also with Australian Chamber Orchestra and so on. So it's, we are talking. Have I missed anybody big? Australian Haydn Ensemble. Undertaking performance research leading to experimental performances and recordings. It goes on and on and on. Anyway, these two are authoritative, shall we say. I am now going to jump into the deep end about this fabulous romantic French CD, but now the big secret about it, the big reveal is not to say authentic instruments, but gut strings, right? Ironwood, gut strings, and of course, I'm set. You know, you've been asked this question a million times, but it's important that people understand, and most musicians do. But this subtle, wonderful, fabulous thing about gut strings, uh, a practice in the 19th century, and then we are. Tell me again. I've got it up here somewhere. But the piano for these two quintets is from 1869. Give me more.
Yep.
Neal.
So, okay. It's a grand piano made in Paris in 1869 by the very famous French firm Erard, who had been around since the end of the 18th century and had a lot to do with the development of the piano, particularly developing towards the more modern piano in the middle of the 19th century. But this piano is a straight-strung instrument, so there's no overstringing, and it's not a fully iron-framed instrument. It has some metal tension bars and a bit of a metal frame, but it's quite different still to the modern, Steinway style instrument that came afterwards. Well, actually, Steinways were building their modern pianos at the same time as these Erards were being built. And it's got a great history. I found it through someone in country Victoria, which is the state next to New South Wales. Mm-hmm. And it is thought that the instrument accompanied Dame Nellie Melba, the famous Australian opera singer of the late 19th, early 20th century, when she came back to Australia to do her tours in Victoria, because she grew up in Melbourne, etc., etc. So it's a great find, and it sits in my room here at the Conservatorium, and perfect instrument for this particular repertoire. It's a little bit perhaps late for the Farronc, but it's absolutely perfect for the Sanson.
Wow, well, was that subtle or what? a little late for the Farronc, but perhaps okay for the Sanson. And again, we're talking mid-19th century, just to get everybody an anchor. Yeah.
Well, in historical performance, or period performance, as it's sometimes called, we try to match as much as we can the dates of instruments to the style of the dates of the music and the style of music. So the Farronc is slightly earlier than the Sansons, and 1869, is more aligned with the Sansons. But it's also difficult, particularly in Australia, to find French instruments of this period. We're perhaps a little bit behind Europe, and we're looking for our period pianos, and we're making collections and things. So I'm in the process of building a collection here at the Sydney Conservatorium, and this is one of the instruments that I had at my disposal. But of course, the Farronc would have been played on later instruments. She and her husband were famous right through to the 1870s, 1880s, and they would have been playing on the instruments that were a la mode, the instruments that were being built right then in the 1860s and 70s. So. And
by the way, that instrument built, and I promise, Danny, we'll get to you.
That's fine.
We'll get to you in a minute. But also, first thing that came into my mind was Paris, 1869. Oh, they got it out of Paris before the Franco-Prussian War. That's why it's still around.
Yeah.
1878.
Well, the instrument was actually made for someone in Australia, in Melbourne.
Oh,
actually in country Victoria. It was ordered, so it was sent straight away once it was made.
Good.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was my tip of the hat to some sort of historical something or other. Let's see. Let me just go down. I think we give everybody satisfactory credits. Okay. I think it's time to just get down to brass tacks, and I'm now going to look at Danny and let him get a word in edgewise here. This idea of, and you are a cellist, the gambist, etc., etc. This idea of, I know we in the profession, and many of my subscribers, many of the subscribers know this, but it's important kind of to get to touch on this. It's a very important issue for Ironwood, of course, doing performance practice with gut. This business of the difference in sound and tonality and timbre and color of gut strings, which speak to the 19th century and before, and metal strings, which of course in this 21st century and 20th century were used so much. What, can I just throw that at you, Danny, and let you?
Of course, yes. Well, I was drawn to the sound of gut strings about 30 years ago. I went along to a concert with some friends playing period instruments, and I was just instantly attracted to that really unique spectrum of timbres that gut strings have. And so that's when I started learning the Baroque cello and really relating to the sound of gut. And to a large extent, it's been just a very practical, experimental experience for me, just getting used to the sounds under my ears, and also hearing how others sound when they're playing on gut strings in concert halls at a distance, which is quite different to the sound under the ear. And then also listening
Oh, very
to...
interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
That almost went over my head. That's very interesting. Excuse me. Go ahead. We'll circle back in a bit.
Because we know that the gut strings have a different series of overtones to metal strings, and the way our ears perceive those when we're really close up to the sound source is quite different to the way they're perceived at a distance in a concert hall. So yes, as I said, a lot of it has just been a really practical, experimental journey of discovery for me.
And again, your experiences with John Elliott Gardner, we mentioned, fabulous conductor, and as I mentioned moments ago,
Yes.
or off camera, but really changed my whole world of Baroque, understanding Baroque repertoire, tempi, and timbres, and
Yes.
colors, and rhythms, and all of that. And also the what's the orchestra in Paris, the 18th century orchestra.
There's the one that plays 19th century repertoire is the Orchestre des Champs-Élysées.
No, sorry.
You might be thinking one of the early what plays Baroque repertoire.
Yeah, that John Elliott Gardner.
Les Arts Florissants.
No, so I guess we're in trouble. I'll see it up here in a bit. We're not in trouble. The point is that it's fascinating to hear Beethoven symphonies, Schubert symphonies, and so on, if you will, authentic instruments, or gut instruments, and it's a completely different, wonderful, exciting, and very satisfactory sound. There is something visceral, you'll forgive the expression, about that sound, and also it helps people to understand, I think, this idea of salon music of 19th century, a small room, so that the sounds could be very much more delicate, not as kind of piercing as we understand this same repertoire in the 20s when performed on metal strings. Go ahead. Should I move on? Or have we done it with guts? I love the way you say gut. It just is so visceral. It just
Visceral,
I think somewhere in one of your for Ironwood, one of your things, la 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 la, and they do and they just love gut or so. Something like that, and I just think that's fabulous. Okay, I'm in trouble, I'm sure. Let's talk about, this is the sort of thing about, as you've already told us, Danny, but Neal, were you a pianist? And then you said, I kind of like this repertoire here, and how do I play it more authentically? What's that about?
Well, yeah, no, my journey with it was that I grew up playing the piano, and even at university I started as a pianist, but on day one of university I was introduced to the harpsichord by a really wonderful teacher, and my whole world changed at that point, and I realized that matching the sounds of instruments like the harpsichord with the repertoire, let's just say Bach for instance, brought a whole new understanding to that repertoire that I didn't have before that when I played it on the piano. And so subsequently I spent all of my university years, undergraduate years, studying performance practice and playing on period, the collection that we had then, which was only very few instruments, one harpsichord, one forte piano, and a chamber organ, for example. And I learned to play continuo as well, figured bass and improvising and that sort of stuff. And that was all very much part of it. But then it's been a voyage of discovery since then. I went to the UK and did postgraduate study. And then, Danny and I were both in a group there called Florilegium, and that's where we really cut our teeth in period performance on period instruments. And I got a chance to play on all sorts of different types of pianos. I know we were going to have this discussion around
such a segue. Please continue.
Let's segue into that. But so in those days, the generic term for an early piano, let's just say from the time of Mozart and Haydn and early Beethoven, was called forte piano. And that term was used for example, in Vienna. They called it a forte piano there, but they also called it a hammerklavier, and they called it other things. And at the same time in England, they called it a pianoforte. So basically, we use the term forte piano nowadays to mean an instrument perhaps pre-Farronck, if you see what I mean, or pre-Saint-Saëns. Uh, I would say forte pianos could be used for an instrument up to the time of Brahms, even because Brahms's piano that he loved was, for all intents and purposes, a very large version of the sort of instrument that Mozart played on. Same style of making, etc., etc.
Interesting.
Bigger, more sound. So yeah, the different names that we use for these early keyboards doesn't mean all that much, but it can nowadays give us a sense of the type of instrument that you might be going to hear. So rather than the piano, you're going to hear a forte piano or a pianoforte, that sort of thing. I'm rambling, but these earlier pianos just brought a whole, like the gut strings, they brought a whole new sound world, a whole new idea of timbre and texture and balance between instruments, balance between piano and strings and things like that. But I'm going to also, and Danny could talk about this, a segue again, is that it's not just the instruments, it's not the period instruments alone that we've been experimenting with, it's also how people played expressively. And that opens up a whole world of new techniques that were kind of forgotten and actually even expunged in the early 20th century when modernism rose and when we went into this idea of text faithfulness. So, what we see in the score is what we need to play, really. So in the early 20th century, we moved away from the expressive practices of the previous century, and those expressive practices from the previous century were anchored in practices from the 18th and even sometimes the 17th century. So, there was this continuum of practice that obviously it evolved, but there were lots of things that went back several centuries, and then suddenly in the 20th century they were stopped. And I'm going to pass over to Danny now because
well, no, you will not pass over to Danny just yet. Thank you very much. I happen to be the host here, which is that I want to make sure I'm very clear because, of course, you have hit upon something that we'll also discuss between these two works. That we touched on this before we pushed record. The pharynx, the colorations, the instrumentation, and so on, the pharynx and Saint-Saëns, and so on, and how that works. But help. I'm going to give it to you, Danny, but this is what's so fascinating. Oh, it's what I've heard, I think, in this recording. I use a corny, probably totally inappropriate, Gemütlichkeit. There's this kind of lovely little things that I notice that are, in a way, performance practice. I hope I'm on the right page here. And go, Danny.
Yeah. So I'm sure that what you're picking up on is on lots of little decisions that we've made about, as Neal says, about how we render the music expressive, and so the kinds of things that we've experimented with are a real flexibility of tempo, and of course composers give us some indication of when they would like the musicians to broaden or to accelerate. But we've been experimenting with adopting the practice of tempo flexibility, even when it's not indicated in the score, and that can mean whole scale tempo modification, as in accelerating or decelerating. But it can also mean nuancing little motifs, so that they're not exactly as written rhythmically in the score. Little lingerings on notes that are above really beautiful expressive harmonies, and we can regard that as matching. If the music was set to text, then it may well be that an important part of a word is over the note where we've chosen to linger.
The eggs are ready. Sorry.
That wasn't the dog.
Let me just jump in for just a moment, and then I do want you to continue because this is so important, especially about this CD. Yes. But I mean, there's all the words, stylistic, little nuanced things. It's in effect what I heard was now I'm going to get in huge trouble, I'm sure, with you guys. But what I heard was an extension of, quite logically, of Baroque performance practice, and we know there are tons, the French, the German, so on. into the early and up to middle 19th century, the leftovers of those. That's what I was referring to. The little things, the little sighs, the characteristic things, and it's performance practice. Who knows, really, right?
Oh, exactly,
well,
exactly. And, yeah, sorry, carry on, Neal. Yeah.
We have some. Well, what's really interesting is that we have some idea of how things sounded, of course, because we have early recordings. We have recordings from, from about the 1890s through to 1920 before electrical recording, or 1926 really, before electrical recording started. We have recordings of Saint-Saëns playing the piano on piano rolls, for example. We have acoustic recordings of him playing. So we have some fairly good idea about the sorts of things Danny was talking about: tempo flexibility, also rhythmic flexibility, elongating certain notes, shortening others. So playing a little bit more like jazz is actually played, that type of sort of flexibility, and not necessarily having to be together all the time, but trying to bring out important notes and things like that. So we've got those in early recordings, and then we can actually read about performance practices from the mid-19th century in treatises from the time, and
reviews,
in documents.
Reviews reveal tons of stuff. Yeah,
fascinating stuff, And
I'm
then
thinking of Beethoven,
match.
for example. The critics of Beethoven 9, of the performances of Beethoven 9, they told us very clearly what they heard in those reviews, and then everybody paid no attention for 200 years. You know what I mean? I'm speaking of the faster tempi, all that whole issue. We don't need to go there just now, but it's fascinating as we somehow not only intuit but also become better informed about performance practice. Again, hats off to John Elliott Gardner for helping us to understand the excitement of that period. Now, have I interrupted for anybody in a mid-thought?
Well, it's just interesting. What comes to me when you mention Beethoven, for example, is the fact that, in 1910, we have the first recorded Beethoven Fifth Symphony by a group in Germany. The name's escaping me right now. And when you hear this, it's on. You can listen to it on YouTube. When you hear it, you'll be amazed at the tempo flexibility and the pulling around and the rushing. When the music gets excited, these players just take off like there's a rocket under them, in a way that sounds very uncontrolled and very different to how we've been taught in the 20th and 21st centuries to think about that music. And so it's really eye-opening and ear-opening as well to hear it, and to hear to the extent to which we have to go in order to bring that type of expression to the music. It's almost alien. It's something that we never learned when we were at music college.
Sure.
We didn't learn that.
Remember the recordings of Baroque repertoire from the 40s? Wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, just plain wrong. And likewise, I can't hear Beethoven 9 anymore unless it's done at the proper tempi. I just can't do it.
Yeah.
I just can't go there. So, and it's so much more exciting at those faster tempos. Anyway, I'm going to jump in and play host again for a minute here, because on this CD are your colleagues in Ironwood, and then I want to ask about the origins of that name. Let's just, why don't I give the names and just give me an idea of how long the ensemble have they been in the something like that. You guys wing it after. I mean, Rachel Beasley and Robin Wilson play in the Saint-Saëns, violinists. Yeah.
Yep.
Simon Oswell is viola. Danny Yeadon is cello. Rob Nairn is the double bassist in the Ferenc, and believe me, we're going to talk about this woman, extraordinary composer. And the piano, as you mentioned, is an Erard from Paris, 1869. Anything else? How long is that the core of Ironwood? And then how come and where and when did Ironwood come together? What's that all about?
Oh yes, so Ironwood was formed. We started. It was called Ironwood Ensemble initially, and we formed in 2006. Initially as a string quartet playing on gut.
You love that. Go ahead.
And we were just interested. We were particularly interested in exploring the classical string quartet repertoire, the early string quartet repertoire.
You mean Haydn?
Not just Haydn, Mozart.
Yeah.
and early Beethoven, but also lesser known composers, and there are so many of them that wrote string quartets. So we did that for a while, and then shortly afterwards, Neal joined us, which allowed us to explore all of the classical repertoire with forte piano. And then our research interests took us into a slightly later period. We felt that we'd assimilated the classical genre.
Really?
Well, there's always more to learn, of course, but
I'm being terrible.
we
Excuse
found
me.
ourselves being drawn to experimenting with playing the romantic repertoire on these instruments. And Neal was also doing lots and lots of research into 19th century piano performance practices. So at that point, I guess it was about 10 years ago now when we started to play later repertoire. And that's been the most amazing journey. So Rachel Beasley was a founding member with me in 2006. Neal joined shortly after that, as did Robin Wilson, who came on board as another violinist. Robin did some research into Brahms' performance practices with Neal as his supervisor. So he's written a wonderful thesis on performance practices, string performance practices at the time of Brahms. So he came
at parties.
on board.
You don't sit around and talk pulp novels. Apparently, go ahead.
Indeed. So Robin has led the later repertoire that we've played. And Simon came on board more recently, about 5 years ago, because up until that point he was living in California, living in LA. He
got fed up, apparently.
He was there for how long, Neal? Was it about 20 years?
Oh,
15, 20 years? Lived there for a long time,
yeah.
playing chamber music all across America, but also he did a lot of recording, a lot of the big Hollywood film scores. So
yeah, you burn out on that stuff, that
Yeah.
pressure very quickly. Yes,
pressure. Yeah,
I have friends. Yeah,
and
Fascinating.
Rob Nairn, the bass player, was also in America for a long time. He had a post at Penn State Uni. He was a bass tutor at Penn State Uni for a long time, and he returned to Australia about 5 years ago with his American wife and family.
Nice. Well, so far, those two have made the proper decision to get out while they can. So there you go. I don't just mean of Los Angeles, as you know. There are troubles in this country. See, we talked about. Please.
I think it'd be good to add to say that we bring to the group a real wealth of experience from different areas. So Danny was trained in the UK. I did my formative early music training in the UK as well. But Rachel was in The Hague in Holland.
Nice.
That's where she studied Baroque violin. And Robin really is a guru of modern violin teaching here in Australia. He's actually one of the top teachers here. Rob Nairn used to play in the Australian Chamber Orchestra, and then he came to London and specialised in Baroque bass, and has gone on. So we were all coming from different angles, and I think that's what brings something really great. That experience brings a great sort of variety and wealth of knowledge to the group. So when we have rehearsals, people are coming from different angles, and then we see what we can bring together. It's also important to say that we've done a lot of Baroque playing. Like that used to be also a core thing for us. We probably do a little bit less of that these days, but so yeah.
I saw that on your website. And by the way, all of this, the interview, my review, the CD, and everything will go up at Performing Arts Review. But links to buy the CD, all that good stuff. But I did see that on your website, and that does lead to that question: are your interests inching you away, inching you into the mid 19th century? It's wide open, it seems to me.
I want to jump in and say one thing. It's not inching us away. What it's doing, I think it's doing is opening up a new possibilities for playing earlier music. Because one thing that's interesting is that we had these pioneer musicians that the Gustav Leonhardt and John Elliott Gardner as well, and Christopher Hogwood, and all these very famous names from the 1970s when they were recording all this stuff. And that was great. And then I think period instrument performance has kind of stayed on a path that they set up and not changed all that much. And of course, everything about it is invented in a way. We've had to reimagine how music was performed in those eras before recording, right? So there's also now an opportunity to reassess what we're doing. And by playing the later repertoire where we have recordings, we can actually get used to that and then ask questions about what it might have sounded before that time, or the recording era. And it actually leads to slightly different choices and options in the earlier repertoire in the 18th and 17th centuries. So I think it's actually very exciting because we're re-looking at the Baroque repertoire with different eyes, so to speak, and with extended knowledge.
Danny, your turn to lash out at me. I apologize, but it is interesting about performance practice. There's a whole huge 300 years something that you can say performance practice. We have really no idea before early recording.
That's true. Yes. A lot of it is guesswork and extrapolation back from the early recordings that Neal referred to. So what springs to mind in terms of string playing is something that we've explored particularly on this disc is a lot of on the string bow strokes, which are and so I'm beginning to experiment with using some of those bow strokes in the earlier repertoire as well, and so that's a very interesting discovery.
And by the way, you just opened up a whole huge memory vat of my own as a kid. The only person that ever said on the string, on the string, on the string constantly, and he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to the California Chamber Symphony. It must have drove, but those little in modern repertoire anyway. That idea of the bow on the string. So you just, and I thought, oh, thank you. Henry Temyanka was my conducting teacher for a while. But so Henry, thank you. That was a big revelation, really.
Yes.
About bow on the string.
Well, what's interesting is that, in terms of string playing, is that there's a layer of interpretation that varies from one reader to the next about how to interpret references to articulation. And in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was a lot of very off-the-string bow strokes, and that's still going on now in the period instrument movement for playing early repertoire. Yes, the layer of interpretation is really. I'm looking at it with fresh perspective, having read treatises of people like de Berriot, who was in Paris and Brussels in the mid-19th century, and he talks about a whole spectrum of bow strokes that are on the string, even if they are articulated. And so the string players in Ironwood have been experimenting with those bow strokes, playing a lot more towards the tip or from the middle to the tip of the bow, and achieving a shortness by using détaché or martelé bow strokes rather than automatically bringing them off the string. Experimenting with that in the Baroque period does lead to a very different interpretation again to the ones that were set up in the 70s and 80s.
Oof. Well, you just set me up all right. I'll lose sleep over this one because it is so fascinating. And I wanted to mention earlier, in terms of Haydn, I'm thinking of the Takash String Quartet, which plays for me, my first experience with hearing Haydn tweaked, if you will, the phrasing, all of that good stuff, out of meter, out of tempo, was Takash, and of course it changed my whole world. I mean, it changes everything when you are not just this is dumb, but when you are not just playing notes. And I think for many years people just played notes. Haydn, okay. See what I mean? Yeah. Without any of that subtle kind of interpretation and so on. Okay. Oh, we're getting along. I'll ask that question in a bit. By the way, about this selection of these two works, and we will deal with the works. I'm watching the time here, but I need to speak about these two works with you. so this is a little bit of a silly question, but it's always kind of interesting when an ensemble is involved of colleagues of any number, but especially a kind of chamber ensemble, and in this kind of high ether of scholarly fuss, is there a capo di capi in your group? Is there one person that says, after all the discussions and the arguments and the books are leaved and the notes are taken, no, we'll do it this way?
Well, I would say that for this repertoire, the buck stops with Neal because he was the person that started the research before anyone else. But having said that, he's very flexible in discussions, and it is a journey of discovery. So is that fair thing to say, Neal?
I'd like to nuance what Danny just said by saying,
by all means,
that what I feel I do is drive our interpretation. I drive it by saying, why are we doing it like that? I always ask why, and then and through the work and through rehearsals and through workshops, and then also through group reading of the evidence or listening to the early recordings and that sort of stuff, we then formulate ideas. But actually, you can't do that unless you have absolutely fabulous players. I mean, this I would say that the group of string players that we have here are able to change things in the moment, are able to have the courageousness to try out something that's different and new, and even probably cry because it's hard to do, but then sort of and then come up with something. You're doing a recording. It's very hard in recording because when you're being experimental, it's apt to make things go a bit awry sometimes. You want to do this thing, but then the tuning changes. You want to do this thing, and the rhythm falls apart, and it's not. And then there's the worry about acceptability to the modern taste, because we're at the intersection of repertoire that we're intersecting with the repertoire that modern players play all the time.
Interesting.
So there are all these sort of philosophical and psychological things that are also in play. But to get back to the point, I think someone has to drive it and say, we are going to be experimental, and even if that's a hard thing to do, and then we rely on everyone else to discuss and to bring their ideas in, and so it works well. But I guess, I end up being the tyrant.
Well, there's something about people who always ask why. It's so annoying. So I give you that cap as the capo di capo of this ensemble for the moment. Let's get into these works. First of all, I was actually going to ask, that decision, and you can't tell me the repertoire is limited, but how come you chose these two works? Why the Ferenc? Again, 1807 or something, 1875 are her years. Fascinating person. We're going to talk about this lady, I hope. And Brahms, help, where am I? Saint-Saëns, sorry. Roughly same time, except he managed to live into the 1920s, right? So what from 1813, he may have met Napoleon and lived into the early 20s. It's amazing. But why these two works? Was there a debate? Did the why fellow say why? What? How do you come that to say?
We decided to play the Saint-Saëns piano quintet in a concert in one of our as part of our concert series here in Sydney, and then the idea came up to record it and to really explore the performance practices further. So we were just passing ideas around for a piece that would match the Saint-Saëns. And I think it was Rachel who suggested Ferenc. She had heard the Ferenc, either a recording of it or she'd heard it played at a concert. And so she passed along that as a suggestion, and we listened to both of the Ferenc quintets and were immediately struck by them and felt that they would both actually make a great contrast to the Saint-Saëns. And we decided on the A minor, I think because we warmed to that piece a little bit more than the E major, which is the second, Ferenc's second quintet. And because the pieces are so different, we didn't think it was an issue that they were in the same key.
As opposed to making a decision. making a deliberate decision. Both these works would be in A minor, but they're both in A minor, fascinating. And also, you just reminded me, I only have the day to be with you. You know what I mean? I spend the day listening and taking notes and preparing and then chatting with you. But I remember toward the end of my listening session, somewhere in there, don't ask me where, I thought, yes, I can hear this, if you will. I can hear this. It makes, aural sense, these two works together. So, congratulations to us all. Now look, let's just talk again. We're going to go a bit. I don't care. You don't care. Nobody cares. If people listen to 3 minutes and then shut it off anyway, who cares? But Louise Ferenc, really, to me, she was quite unknown. 1804 to 1875, and I did a little look up about her. But what intrigues me and intrigues all of us is her genius as a composer. She was right in the league. Period. No doubts, no questions, no failures here or slippages there. She was right there, and of course, I'm imagining, you must correct me as scholars, more or less ignored, maybe even. And this woman teaching at the Paris Conservatoire all those years, 30, 40 years or something, and then the anecdote, but I was intrigued. Women in that period, mid 19th century, of course they didn't, just as today, unfortunately, didn't receive the same kind of remuneration. And she actually at a certain point said, hey boys, remember me? I'm good. Pay me the same you pay the others. Bam! I mean, it tells me about the resilience of this woman as a composer. And it's in the music. It must have been so frustrating, but what else is new, I guess, because she is so talented. This quintet is a masterpiece, and I'm just now much more curious to hear the others. In structure, what I mean, everything makes sense. Balancing the. So tell me about this experience with the Ferenc. Is it a difficult quintet to put together? Stuff like that. Oh, and by the way, about the piano, the 1869 piano, very quickly. Are there pedals on that instrument? Had pedals come in?
Yes. Yeah, so there are two pedals, the sustaining pedal and also the unicorda shift, so it shifts from 3 strings to 1 string. So you can, with the Ferenc, it is a tricky piece. It's certainly tricky for the piano.
She being a pianist, she being a pianist.
She was a pianist, and it's as tricky as Mendelssohn's piano writing in many ways, and also Beethoven's. It's a combination of those things, and it doesn't all lie well under the hands, because obviously she's writing for her own. She's the person who performed the works in the first instance, and Danny will probably explain more. But she was very famous within the salon scene in Paris. So a lot of chamber music concerts and things like that, you'd hear Ferenc's music played. She also wrote symphonies, and some of the symphonies are extremely Beethovenian in style and have the same sort of power. I don't know. I think in the time people knew about her, but she was quickly forgotten in the later part of the 19th century. And
that's more accurate based on what you just said a moment ago, which is that of course she was popular in Paris, the salon, and her music she wrote music for these things, but then
And the Ferencs, I mean, her husband Aristide, they were also music publishers, or certainly they published about music and performance, and they were very into early music as well. They published a lot around. I mean, you could count them as the beginning of the early music revival, maybe even. They were things that they wrote about the performance of earlier music and things like that.
Which also makes sense, doesn't it? Mendelssohn.
It does, yeah, absolutely.
And
so.
Sorry?
Playing the Ferenc on the Erard made a lot of sense. It just texturally, the thickness sometimes that you would be quite difficult on a modern piano to bring the clarity, etc., and also the balance between strings and piano is made much easier. I mean, this Erard piano is a very hefty sounding instrument. It's loud, so there's a lot of power behind it, but somehow the range of the instrument, the lightness in the treble, the warmer middle range, and then this kind of very rumbly bass, somehow fits together with the music. she knew how to write for the French instrument, and then with the gut strung instruments and then these period practices, everything becomes clearer and luminous and well balanced. That's what we found.
Let me
Anyway,
jump in, and then Danny can add a bit. But you just reminded me of what I discussed before we taped, which I thought I was hearing a different kind of sound from the piano between the 500, a later piece, kind of sort of, and the Farag. And again, I think you've just clarified that the choice of instrumentation, the colors and all that stuff. The Farag is beautifully balanced, and you had just described this instrument, this 1869 piano, as being loud, which it is very adequately for the 500, a piece from later.
Yes.
Now, excuse me. Go ahead, Danny. Any added thoughts about the Farag? How about performance practice? How about performance practice
Again,
with the strings?
from a string playing perspective, we explored. We had a slightly different approach to vibrato, and we were experimenting with using plenty of portamento. So I've used the word experimental a lot on this call, but we really did just experiment with using more vibrato at places where the harmony was intense, and less when the textures are more transparent. And we experimented with portamento between pretty much every combination of notes that we could in our individual parts. So it took us a while to achieve a synthesis of all these things. And if we were to play the piece in performance, if we were to take it on tour, it would be quite different from one performance to the next, because there's a large degree of spontaneity with these expressive practices. And then in terms of tempo and nuancing, that was something that we discussed extensively in rehearsals. And sometimes that was quite not a painful process, but a tricky process, because we didn't always agree about where to speed up and slow down, and whether nuancing worked with a particular phrase or motif. So there was a lot of discussion and excitement and grumpiness at times. But by the time
That's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of it, isn't it? The creative process and colleagues and everything. It's just I want to weep. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So by the time we got to the recording, I think we had achieved a kind of synthesis.
And by the way, what a melodist was she? What a melodist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just that's what I mean. It must have driven her crazy. Yes, okay. So she's had her career and her support and so on. So in her own lifetime, but somewhere deep down she knew, that she really was right there at the top with everyone. I mean, it's just flawless writing. I hope that isn't too crazy, but just gorgeous writing. And refreshing and creative and wonderful. And again, her decision to use double bass. That's, circa whatever, 1839 to 42 or something. That's jumping right into the fray there, I would think, in terms of what people would say and think. Shall we move on? Because I'm so fascinated by the Saint-Saëns, this again A minor piano quintet. Well, I guess what I'm curious about is it's 1855, and roughly the composition year of this piece, which is Brahms. You know what I'm trying to say? It's Schumann jumping off the bridge. I mean, it's just that Saint-Saëns must have been immersed in that kind of repertoire, I would think, in that kind of romantic mid-19th century repertoire. You want to, Danny? Why don't you jump in at this point? Let's have you. Just give me a kind of an overview about the Saint-Saëns.
Well, one thing that springs to mind is that it seems to have a very different kind of structure to the Farag, and Saint-Saëns is experimenting a lot with special effects, which comes as quite a surprise at that stage of the 19th century. So
that I hadn't thought in my listenings today. I'm going to have to re-listen. Very, very interesting. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well,
it's almost like early film music. Like he's very kind of programmatic and evocative of certain emotions, and yeah. So
Well,
Neal actually wrote the program notes for this
Oh,
the
for
print was
the
too small for
transcript.
me. This will be the so I didn't read them, and and the reason is never again will I take anything electronically.
yeah.
That's the thing. It is not a
Yeah.
criticism. It's just that sure enough I didn't read the notes because they were too small.
Oh,
No, that's a lousy excuse. I didn't
I
read the
think
notes because I didn't think I needed to.
I think you're right. What you said, Dan, was also right. I mean, Saint-Saëns was right there in the middle of the Schumann, the Brahms, also the Chopin. I mean, he's contemporary with Chopin, and they knew each other. But also, as we all felt, Saint-Saëns' music was kind of almost pushing forward. I mean, when you listen to it over and over again, and as we played it, we were hearing bits of Star Wars. We were hearing Blondie singing, themes from Blondie's pop songs, and of course, you only have to think of the
You do
Saint-Saëns
purify the
organ.
water in Australia, don't you? It is
That's right.
it is
You
filtered
do, yeah.
properly. Okay,
It's not,
sorry.
but
Blondie indeed.
you think about Saint-Saëns, for instance, writing the organ symphony, the third symphony, right? And the last movement of that with the organ thundering in, and then these strings play this beautiful melody, which was used in a pop song many years ago in the 70s. I grew up with, but also was
I'm
used
a
in
purist.
that
I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about.
it's been used in films and all sorts of things. So obviously other people thought of his writing as fitting in with this kind of maybe even verging on popular kind of things, where he brought in popular melodies and popular textures. There's in the third movement, I'm thinking about is it the scherzo movement or the
The
third movement,
presto,
slow,
presto. Yeah.
the presto. You suddenly get these dancing girls, and you feel like you're in the middle of a Folies Bergère type of thing, with the
Oh,
can and
interesting. You just saved yourself on that one. Yeah.
listen out for all these sort of Parisian things.
Oh,
It's
you know what it
incredible.
is? Actually, it took me a long time. I just received a call from the man who convinced me of it, but I had never considered Saint-Saëns to be one of the great orchestral composers
Yeah,
for all the
yeah,
reasons you have just described, let alone in the chamber music. This vividly imaginative mind and
yeah.
so on. And after we're done, I'll talk to you about the organ symphony. I have an anecdote after we're done with our interview. But so you are saying, and it speaks to what we kind of touched on earlier about what I was hearing in terms of the piano sounding so much bigger in the Saint-Saëns because the Saint-Saëns is a bigger piece if you get my drift in terms of just his cinematic interests. Danny, you're practically biting your lip. Do you have something to say?
No, I didn't have any particular thought at that point. I was just
Oh,
being carried along, carried along.
okay. So please.
I was going to say that perhaps one way of looking at this disc and what it brings is that you've got Farronk, who you know is classical in mind and spirit and heart, and brings up Beethoven and Mendelssohn and this sort of period of writing and style, and also, but she's also pushing forward a little bit. So, but she's preserving the past. The Saint-Saëns is kind of the next bit of the French story, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's got this classical training, but he's pushing forward into the 20th century in his sound world and outlook and the way he structures the pieces. So
In
it's
1855, no less.
in
Roughly the year of
1855.
this composition, he's already in 1920 or something. I think is kind of what you're
I mean,
getting at, sort of.
yeah, you
Amazing.
sometimes hear Debussyan sort of textures and things like that in the orchestration or the instrumentation of the work. You know, it's beautiful. The slow movement, for example, it's very, very 19th century, late 19th century French,
Gorgeous as well.
but it's 1855. Yeah.
As well. I think we'd better stop, or I think we pretty well wandered through most everything. Does anyone have last remarks before I give us a little overview and shut it down? Anything? Again, we're talking about this wonderful ABC Records release. It also will go up on Performing Arts Review. So on the Canadian label, excuse me, the Australian label. Sorry. And I have been having a chat with Daniel Yeadon, cellist, and pianist Neal Perez da Costa. These two works that Ironwood have recorded, these two fabulous piano quintets on, if you will, authentic instruments. More or less, I always hesitate because I'm not quite sure if that's the correct word, but on authentic instruments. Certainly the gut is authentic on the stringed instruments, but it gives a whole fresh and very interesting, exciting, and clean and quiet, even in many ways, which is kind of interesting as well, approach to this repertoire from really the heart of the mid 19th century French Romantic period. Fabulous CD. I think we're done. Many, many thanks for, again, helping me figure out what 19 hours of difference in time zone are. It gets a little tricky, and I'm getting old. So, but many, many, many thanks. It's been a great, great pleasure. See you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.